Tony Lai is, thanks, Carolina. So Tony Lai, I'm delighted to say, is coming to us from a huge background of legal expertise that sits at the crossroads of conservation, climate change, and what's happening in the world of law. So he works on the Stanford Climate Data Policy Initiative, and is also one of the founders of Stanford's blockchain group called Codex. He's also the founder of a legal technology company called legal.io, and is working across a whole range of different projects in this space around the world. I'm also really delighted to say that Tony is a fellow with the Edmund Hillary Fellowship and happens to be an amazing violin player. But today I think we're going to dig into the piece of work he's doing around the Biodiversity Oracle project. So Tony, I'm going to hand it over to you, and you'll be able to take us on a bit of a journey through what's going on in this work.
Thank you so much, Peter. Everybody, it's very, very much an honor to be here with you all. I know how much the work that you're all doing ties into a lot of the futures that we're essentially all tied together in trying to protect. And one of the fundamental reasons why I came here was that I see a very, very important connection between the worlds and the mindsets of ecology and our approach to interrelationship with nature, with the mindsets and approaches of law and governance and policy. And so that second half is really where my brain has been at, where my mind has been at, and where I've been expending a lot of my efforts to build an ecology of sorts at Stanford, and from Stanford, hopefully further around the world. And that's a part of my effort to dive in beyond the practice of law and policy and governance, which was really my background before diving into research. I was a practicing lawyer for many years, and I really saw the ways in which the structure of practicing law was very much about the application of a certain kind of logic, which was built up over many hundreds of years, going all the way back to Roman law, on the premise that there is a separation between the subject and the object. And I think that from what I've learned from Peter, that separation is really part of the psychological and linguistic and conceptual difference that is really causing some of the underlying epistemological harm, I think, in the ways that we're approaching. So just as a way to say, I'm very grateful that we have people like Peter who are trying to weave interdisciplinarily between different areas and different fields. And as I understand, he's doing in various different ways with arts, with science, and with communication. My understanding is that your commission as well is very much looking to weave some of those fabrics across disciplines, and to try and look in those interstitial places. And so that's very much what I have been able to do through my work at Stanford, particularly around law and technology and law and computer science. One of the joys of being at Stanford is that there's, in some sense, an inherent focus upon the need to look at these interstitial spaces. There's a new sustainability department that's looking at those different areas, and we've been looking at various projects between law, computer science, and sustainability. There we have an initiative called Systems for Resilient Societies, where we gathered together various folks earlier this year to look at that intersection of law, technology, and sustainability. But I'll take a step back for a moment and just to say a little bit more about Codex, which is the center that I'm based at Stanford. Peter mentioned that I run a blockchain group. That's really a sub-research group within a wider center called Codex. And Codex is actually the Stanford Center for Legal Informatics, and a bit of a mouthful, but legal informatics is very much this idea of the science of information flow through the legal system. And that angle, again, is trying to look at legal systems very much as this system of information flow where there potentially can be ways of stepping into some of the computational mechanisms of systems improvement. And so whether that's in terms of looking at the entire process of creating a legal instrument as much more of a software-based challenge, where you can potentially run unit tests over a contract to determine whether there is some error or some, some challenge that we would be paid, ridiculous amounts as lawyers to be using our individual eyes to go in and monitor and seek to find whether, a particular contract or a particular agreement was correct or not. A lot of software tools and computational technology was coming in that was essentially reducing a lot of that drudgery. And so a big part of what the Stanford Center for Legal Informatics was doing was looking at the various different ecosystems of how law was being embedded with certain aspects of computer science and technology in order to create this emerging field of computational law. So just to establish that background, that's a little bit of where I've come from, a little bit of that notion of having that opportunity in the space to dig into the interstitial spaces between law and technology. And so how does that set us up for this notion of blockchain and global public goods, let's say? Because the notion of a biodiversity oracle that Peter just talked about was very much the premise of this wider approach of looking at what are the ways in which, with a computational law framework like blockchain, and again, I'm not sure how familiar this wider group is with some of the sort of basic fundamentals of blockchain. I know we have a representative from the working group, but would it be helpful for me to just do a little bit of a sort of high level on sort of why blockchain is important? Okay, that's useful. Okay, so
I think that'd be great, Tony. Essentially, we've in the first webinar, we've got a really good technical breakdown of how it works, but a recap would be much appreciated.
I see. Okay, fantastic. So one of the ways that I look at blockchain is it's in essence like you're able to play with law like Lego, right? And so again, this is somewhat biased from my perspective as somebody coming from a legal background, but and there are obviously very many technical ways that you can look at the sort of the cryptography that allows you to sort of basically trust that a certain ledger or recording is going to be maintained in the way that the technology says it's going to. But yeah, there's a lot of technical aspects which I imagine you can go through and you can go and look into. But again, I think one of the just conceptual pieces to think about with blockchain is this idea that you have essentially a Lego box of pre-made components that you can essentially put together in order to construct these larger constructs that other people can see, other people can just take and reuse, kind of like if you had actually got the Lego instructions and then you could just press a button and the whole Lego thing appeared in front of you. But the joy is ultimately that you're going to be able to play with it. You're going to be able to use it in such a way that, one, you're not necessarily being supervised or controlled in any way. You're free to sort of like take that sort of Lego sort of contract, as it were, or sort of maybe it's an entire structure for coordinating and cooperating. There's this. How many people here have heard of the phenomenon of the platform cooperatives? Okay, so this was something that happened pre-blockchain, but it's also another sort of theme of this wider world of law and technology coming together that I got very excited about when it first arrived 9 or 10 years ago. There's somebody called Nathan Schneider, who's done a lot of work in this area. But essentially, what a platform cooperative is imagine if there was an Uber or an Airbnb or a Grubhub or a Deliveroo, or there's various different versions of these sharing economy companies. They're essentially getting large groups of people together, and then you've got a technology platform in the middle. And in the old version of that technology platform world, you had venture capitalists coming in, funding the technology company builders, and they would establish themselves in the middle, take a decent cut, and become billionaires, right? That is one version of how you can establish a technology platform in the middle and coordinate and orchestrate a whole bunch of people to do certain kinds of things where you're not really necessarily owning any of those underlying assets. Now, a platform cooperative essentially takes that model where you have a platform and you have various people like working and providing different services as part of that platform. Maybe some people provide the house, and some people provide the cleaning, and some people need a house. The difference with the platform cooperative is that you don't have some venture capital funded technology company extracting all the value into essentially Silicon Valley. Instead, that technology is open source. It's free for anybody to use, and the people who are running it are part of a cooperative. And so all of the profits from that are coming out and being shared equally amongst all of the homeowners, or shared equally amongst all of the drivers, in a way. And so that wider notion of the platform cooperative, rather than the surveillance capital platform technology a la Facebook or Uber or others like that, that was a sort of a principle framework that allowed people to take a model for how to run it still does allow people to do that. There's a certain complexity to it at the moment, before blockchain, but essentially what blockchain enables us to do is to take that whole model of a platform cooperative and sort of unfold it out, including with a lot of those sort of legal contracts and rights of recourse and conflict management sort of frameworks that, a previously centralized company might be using. Now, again, there are a few key pieces there that are, I think, elements of a wider, systemic tapestry that are starting to come together in certain areas, right? So again, I think the reason why you probably haven't heard of a platform cooperative is that there aren't that many locally owned competitors to Uber that have succeeded in certain localities, but they have in some, right? And so there are different aspects of that. Now, I lay that notion of a sort of an open source technology layer for allowing coordination as, again, this train of conceptual thinking, but also that there's a train of actual practical building that's happening. Because again, you've got a few key things that happen when you move to an open source technology underpinning. You have certain open standards and replicability that can be used. And again, this is that sort of Lego analogy. You have this ability to have them like interoperate, right? So interoperability is also this key aspect of when you move to an open source technology platform, people can play together, right? So you can have, you can build things together knowing that they're going to fit together, right? So that's also a key aspect of open source in general and, what blockchain inherits. The piece that is in addition to what open source technology and open source platform cooperatives. So you've got this sort of lineage from things like, Linux, which basically runs most of the internet in terms of open source operating system for server technology and all of the different internet pieces and even smart fridges and all these things are running on Linux. So you've got open source software that lineage, and then you've got sort of open source platform technology sort of instantiations, and then moving on, you move towards blockchain, which also then starts to embed this ability to not have double spending. Essentially, it's the core thing to remember is it's just a way of record keeping But record keeping is incredibly powerful. Double entry bookkeeping, back in the medieval times, enabled vast amounts of trade because you didn't have to carry all of this heavy and potentially stealable, valuable goods around anymore. You could use the banking system that the Venetians and then others started to set up. The Dutch were also very, very on top of this. But blockchain is essentially a version of that upgrade. And some people have called it triple entry bookkeeping, but it enables that same challenge of being able to have the same underlying record. And that really is about not allowing double spending. So if you've spent that, or if you've done something here, like somebody else knows that you've done it there. Now, so again, I'm trying to move along in steps here where we've got blockchain, where you've got this additional piece on top of that open source platform technology coordination system, which then also includes the records. And again, that records piece can be used, that has been used primarily for value tracking. And so you have Bitcoin, which was the first of these blockchains to demonstrate this ability to not have double spending without requiring a sort of a big central organization that potentially doesn't have legitimacy or can't be trusted or might be open to hacking or might charge extortionate fees for performing that centralized role. The cost for transferring funds lightning fast with at fairly low cost, that was a need that was solved by that particular blockchain. Now, it showed the way, but it's sort of fairly narrow in its use case. And again, it's very much focused on money in the conventional sense. If you go one step further than that, you get to Ethereum. And Ethereum is akin to Bitcoin in the sense that you've got the ability to have these Lego pieces, but at the same time, you can't basically spend the same token or coin or amount of value in one place versus another. But Ethereum really allows you to start programming that money, and so you enter the concept of a smart contract. And this is really where I started coming into this whole world because of my interest in computational contracts. So there was a sort of a fairly long history of work at my center and elsewhere around the world, working on the idea that you can have law and technology computationally coming together. And so that was a pre-existing set of ideas that, a lot of research being done around a lot of different deployments. You see it happening in existing systems, stock exchanges and various different things where you've got things happening at vast speeds, and it's all because it's sort of programmed computational contracts. The difference with smart contracts versus just computational contracts, when we're talking about this, this evolving world of coordination between law and technology, is that smart contracts build in this double spending aspect where you can have these computational contracts that are essentially encoded rules and roles within the context of a multi-party system. And you're taking that and making it so that it can essentially run in a global fashion without any intermediary. So this idea of being able to have global coordination, essentially templates, is the idea of the smart contract that can then form the foundation potentially for this notion of global public goods. And so this, my apologies if I'm taking my time getting there, but this is like weaving our way from sort of like the basics of law, technology coming together through open source, platform cooperatives, blockchain, smart contracts, and then global public goods. So hopefully this, following this thread here, it's a fairly complex journey that I've been taking, but I'm really grateful to be able to bring you along because, as I said at the beginning, I think that one of the most important intersections that I've been hoping for is between this whole world of blockchain and the world of ecology and conservation. And really, when we start talking about global public goods, we're talking about not necessarily things that are universal or things that apply across space and time, but really things that can take a global form. I mean, this is something I was reading from the Interspecies Politics, a very interesting book that sort of, I think, much more from your respective backgrounds than mine. But I guess the politics piece of me was sort of brings me in from the perspective of thinking about global forms as, in a sense, the global policies, or in my language, the global smart contracts that apply globally. They don't need to apply all the time everywhere, but what they can do is they can apply across various different diverse cultures, and they can be tailored to those diverse cultures, but they can still apply across those. And so this takes me to then thinking about, the Stanford Climate Data Policy Initiative. And so this was one of the initiatives that began out of our blockchain group at Stanford. We've had various different projects come out, including an academic journal, the Stanford Journal for Blockchain Law and Policy. We have a sort of a regulatory convening function. But one of the pieces that we were particularly interested in was like the application of blockchain to coordinating around climate and the data that's coming out at various different levels, but also specifically around some of the policies that could help to lay the basis for the requirements of that data. And so the initiative has been advising in particular in the California Senate. Some of my colleagues have been working for some time with the Senate there, and there's upcoming legislation that would require all companies doing business in California that do over $1 billion in revenue to report their scope 1, 2, and 3 climate emissions. So that includes the climate emissions coming from their supply chains, not just within their operations of their organization itself. Again, Microsoft to some extent has already voluntarily committed to an infrastructure like that. But again, in thinking about the role of policy and law and regulation, there's this combination of both obviously nation state actors that are being engaged through the COP process, but there are also all of these multi-level other actors, whether it's at the state level, the city level, corporations, citizens and communities themselves. And so that polycentric nested accounting system for climate is really what we've been looking at in conjunction with some of the policymakers who are looking not necessarily at the national level, but at the California state level in this particular instance, but how those might set precedents, how those might start setting the baseline for what people do or don't have to report. And again, this is when we talk about nested accounting system, I also wanted to point to the work of our colleagues at the Open Earth Foundation. If we have time, they have a little video that they just shared with me that I can share with you as well, that speaks into a lot of this idea of that sort of nested accounting system for incorporating data from various different sources at the national and the local. And again, the idea of the Stanford Climate Data Policy Initiative with people like Open Earth and others. There's Angel Su at the Data Driven Lab, who's been doing some really, really important work in this space. But the key thing is to establish not just the technical data interoperability frameworks for what data you have to be providing in what kinds of formats, but to also provide those legal and regulatorily interoperable aspects through the provision of that data at certain levels of quality with certain guarantees and certified sort of provenance around that data. And so this again is where all of the different ledger aspects of blockchain come into their own. And so in establishing the beginnings of a interoperable data architecture for this kind of climate data, the Stanford Climate Data Policy Initiative with folks like Open Earth are really trying to build this out as an open source interoperable blockchain-based layer rather than a proprietary system that can end up with lock-in and a real lack of interoperability. Something that only works in one jurisdiction is not going to form the basis for a global public good in this way. The other piece, the other really, really major piece that I will mention, and I really want to get across about why blockchain-based infrastructure for this kind of global public goods architecture is important, is because of the aspects of transparency and accountability that one can embed within a system like that. So it's really about, showing that everybody is playing by the rules. Everybody is following the framework that we've laid out, and everybody can be held accountable to that. So it's like, that notion that, sunshine is really one of the best disinfectants for corrupt behavior. There is this very interesting balance between this notion of, okay, blockchain is all about crypto and keeping things private, but there's also this notion of transparency, what gives, well, one of the ways one can sort of square that circle, so to speak, is to know that, like, in terms of the transactions that are happening in a particular ledger, it's like, yes, everybody can come and see what has happened. That's basically how it works. However, there are these aspects of privacy that are very important to bear in mind, that take into account, yes, the fact that this is an open, transparent ledger and everybody can look at it, but what I put onto that ledger only needs to be enough, not so that other people can see, but so that other machine-based agents can see. And those machine-based agents don't necessarily need to see the human readable data. And so this is one of the ways where these forms of technology are able to sort of square the circle of transparency and privacy. There's some techniques called, and again, this is getting too technical beyond my own pay grade to sort of like fully understand the details, but there's some ways of understanding. I encourage you all to sort of check them out. It's called the zero knowledge proofs. Zero knowledge proofs are essentially a way for us to be able to keep our private data, the human readable and human understandable data, private, and it effectively allows a machine-based system to validate not that that underlying data is what the underlying what you say it is, but that not to see the underlying data, but but it can validate that the underlying data is what you say it is. So essentially, this allows for you to, let's say you're a big company that's producing lots of carbon emissions, right? You're being required to provide all of this data about your carbon emissions as a result of these policies. But if you were to provide the actual data itself, you might be giving away a lot of different trade secrets about a lot of your different operations that you don't want your competitors to know about. Well, the beauty of both having that transparency, but also being able to enable privacy through these tools known as zero knowledge proofs, is that you can actually have them share the actual thing that you need to know, i.e. that they had a certain amount of carbon outputs, and that can be validated. It's a little bit like having an auditor go in, and the auditor is not allowed to say what they've seen, but they say, yeah, no, the books are fine, right? And so that kind of mechanism is, again, from a technological perspective, being built in to enable some of these wider global public goods alignment frameworks. Now, I've taken a long time getting to biodiversity oracles, and my apologies that this has been slightly meandering. We do have some white papers coming out on this after a gathering we'll be having this weekend with some of the folks from Open Earth. But one of the key companies that we're working with to build this is a company called Planet Labs. They're now just called Planet, but they essentially do Earth imaging of the Earth every day. They've launched several hundred satellites, and they're trying to provide this data layer to help standardize and support the sort of ongoing analysis of what's happening to our biosphere, what's happening in various different bioregions. And so they're not in any way a blockchain company. They're a data company. They're a hardware company. They build spacecraft and they launch those. But they have been looking, with my help and that of others, and some of these gatherings, at what it might look like to have their data of the entire Earth every day and how it's changing, incorporated with other data sources, but essentially made available as part of a verified layer of information that is accessible to any of these smart contracts and systems of financial coordination that are coming down, and that can take this data about a particular bioregion and use that as part of its calculations. And so an oracle at a very general level is essentially any source of data that can be used within a blockchain context, that can be used for this layer of coordination and calculation. And so when we talk about a biodiversity oracle, we're talking specifically about what are the ways in which we can channel underlying biodiversity vitality and health and make that available for some of these systems of coordination. Now, those systems of coordination include new eco coins or carbon coins. For those of you who've read Ministry for the Future, there's a Carboni that Kim Stanley Robinson refers to, and something called the Global Carbon Reward is something that exists in reality. The sort of the Chen plan is based upon someone called Delton Chen, who's going to be joining us this weekend as well. And so we're really trying to weave this notion of, and I highly recommend Ministry for the Future for those of you who haven't read it. It's an excellent book that goes into some of this idea of blockchain for global public goods in a very tangible way. But really the idea is that there's certain ways that we can take this underlying data about, for example, how much carbon is being drawn down, but I think we're more generally interested in the wider nature positive potential and all of the various different metrics and ways that we can measure the state of that sort of vitality of biodiversity that's going to be so fundamental, not just for solving the carbon issue, but like a whole range of ecosystem and life dependent services. So having those available for currencies that are able to be backed essentially by the health of nature is one thread of where this notion of biodiversity oracle that is sort of inputting this data that can be updated probabilistically. And so there's a whole thread of active inference that is playing into the sort of the monetary policies of these. And active inference is a sort of a theory from Carl Friston, talks about the brain as a Bayesian inference engine. Essentially, if we're going to be creating a sensor and action capability as a global public good for the planet, then we can't be thinking in these absolutist terms either. All of data and all of the ways in which we're able to sense and act are, in a sense, probabilistic. And then, so part of the oracle's job is also to bake in an appropriate mechanism to show how valid or how much confidence like one can have in that data, and also provide a mechanism for increasing that confidence. So people on the ground being paid and resourced to actually, provide better ground truth, as it were, on top of, any remote sensing capabilities. The other aspect, and then I'll leave it there because I'm seeing a bunch of questions coming in, and I'm conscious of time as well. But again, thank you for this time for sharing some of this journey. The other aspects where the data coming out of those biodiversity oracles is in particular exciting is making that data available to artists and musicians and various different creative expression sort of spaces, purely because a lot of this underlying data and a lot of the ways that we're measuring the vitality of biodiversity is yet to be fully metricized. There's yet to be a full component of agreement around those underlying standards of what does it mean to have a healthy biodiversity. It can change in various different places. So the fungibility of that notion of what's healthy in one place versus another is still to be determined. At the same time, there are so many different qualitative angles to how we can start measuring and seeing and helping individual collectors, organizations, and others to have this sort of qualitative connection, a qualitative relationship that is based around one's awareness, not necessarily, of like how much quantitative value I have to spend or how much quantitatively this is affecting, but really qualitatively, how is this, potentially creating ecosystem services that maybe don't fit into a fungible carbon drawdown system, but that can actually help me stay on a consciousness level more connected through the power of art and music, and then ultimately start to allow that on a collective basis, right? And so these are I think the various mechanisms of recognizing that we are in a system where today, with some of these Web2 companies like the Facebooks and the others of the world, we're not just in a physically, environmentally polluted ecosystem. We're more and more in an informationally polluted ecosystem. And so I'll leave it at this last point is that I think as part of our work with the biodiversity oracles, and hopefully as part of the work that your commission can be doing, it's not just to establish this sort of the metrics and the data interoperability standards. I think our job is very much to really try and raise the level of consciousness of individuals and groups and ultimately the world. And I think that consciousness raising aspect, to the extent that we can find all the different modalities of creating these shared relationships and shared consciousnesses, not just through law and technology, but ultimately also through art and sociology and all the different ways of seeing and ways of knowing, to the extent that any tools that we build can increase our capacity to do that in tighter coupling with nature, I think we'll be doing well. And so I'll leave it there. I hope to be able to share more written and sort of carefully prepared materials in the next week or two off the back of this weekend we'll be having. But I appreciate you letting me ramble for half an hour, and thank you very much for listening. I'll take a look at some of the questions now.
Okay.
Peter, maybe you want to just direct some at me, or Carolina?
Yes, thank you so much, Tony, for the time you've taken to share with us, and also that really thorough and really well explained background for kind of a refresher for those of us who had forgotten a little bit from the first session. So for anyone wanting to ask questions, you can either drop them in the chat or raise your hand. And maybe, Tony, I can send you the first one that we have in the chat, which is from Frank.
Yes, I read.
Question...
So I'll read the question. Of the blockchain ecosystems that are emerging, Ethereum, Solana, Cosmos, etc., which ones are more advanced in their thoughts and community in terms of working towards stewarding nature commons? So I'm slightly biased here because one of the groups I'm working with is building on Cosmos. They're called Regen Networks, and they're developing a specific blockchain on the Cosmos infrastructure that's for eco credits. So I mentioned eco coins, the term eco credits, eco coins, slightly interchangeable, but essentially they are one of the differences between Cosmos and Ethereum, and I won't go too much into Solana, but certainly Cosmos is what's called it allows you essentially to create your own layer one blockchain, and the technical details and differences between Ethereum versus Cosmos are slightly beyond what we necessarily need to go into, but suffice to say that there's both Ethereum and Cosmos, as of the recent Ethereum merge you may have heard about, by the way, they're all proof of stake now. So it means that they use a much sort of like 99% less energy than they used on the sort of proof of works way. So both of those, from that perspective, are sort of nature friendly for stewarding commons. There are a lot, I would say, of Ethereum projects, Ethereum-based projects, because of the framework that they set up for essentially for smart contract standards. These are called ERC, and there's various different ERC Ethereum essentially upgrades that are collectively done, and there's sort of Ethereum. These standards have been made available in Ethereum for tokens, for fungible tokens, for non-fungible tokens. It's a multi-purpose blockchain. The difference with Cosmos is that it allows you to set up very, very single-purpose blockchains, and that's what our friends at Regen Networks have done. They've set up a blockchain specifically for managing the governance around the flow of resources and funds to these ecological projects on the ground. They're working with various folks, in particular in Ecuador, who recently had the Supreme Court decision which annulled the mining concession rights in Los Cedros National Preserve. And that has kind of opened this space where these eco credits might be a substitute for the sort of the debt that Ecuador really can't pay back, if these mining collaterals are illegal. Now, I don't put it past the IMF to, use some muscle to try and reimpose those, but I think there's space right now to be looking at what are these alternatives? Can we create a sort of a debt for nature framework? And so the folks at Regen Networks are working hard to push that as well. And I guess the key difference to bear in mind is when you have a more single purpose blockchain, and you're not trying to do many different things, you're able to balance that sort of dilemma between security and sort of utility and the decentralized nature of what you're building. And so yes, I think I'm speaking somewhat about a project that I've been involved with. I want to step back from that opinion as well and say also that there's a similar to Solana. There's also another blockchain called NEAR. It's the NEAR protocol. I know that they've been working on various different nature-based projects and stewarding nature as well. The CFO there is deeply supportive of nature related projects as well. Any other questions?
So,
yeah,
I think from the chat that was it, but I can see that Peter has a hand raised.
Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Carolina. Yeah, so Tony, part of what I'm really curious about, sort of as we've taken this whole journey through the fundamentals of blockchains and sort of the possibilities that this infrastructure allows us to transparently and sort of immutably audit on-ground conservation practice relative to real-world data inputs. Is sort of if we look forward, another 5 years from now and look at how is conservation monitoring going to be done internationally with local stewardship and international data sets and satellite imagery and so forth. What do you see the role of this infrastructure providing in that mesh?
Thank you, Peter. So 5 years' time, I think we'll be essentially on our way towards establishing this, let's call it a parallel stocktake that's essentially happening partially on a voluntary basis and partially on a sort of a regulatory basis. I think we're going to have this patchwork of regulatory policies that are going to be, at the city level, the state level, maybe some countries, but that are going to require certain groups operating within their jurisdictions to, if not abide by certain kinds of limits, at the very least to be tracking the data. What is your impact, right? So various different organizations will be also stepping forward to do that voluntarily. So that you've got the policy piece here, and you've got organizations that are voluntarily seeking and stepping up to doing that. You've seen Patagonia recently become a perpetual purpose trust, a for-profit company setting itself up to be able to ultimately be aligned with nature. And its corporate actions are now 100% dedicated towards that. It took time to get there, but I think we will see more of those companies as well. So you've got the policymakers, you've got the corporations, and the question is the coordination layer across all of them, I think, is this blockchain aspect. And you talked about local, how does this play into the local conservation efforts? Well, partly this is in terms of what I was saying about the connection aspect, the consciousness connection aspect, to the extent that we seek to embed within that new layer of value transfer a parallel level of connection through data that is about the stories of where your resources are going to. So an analogy I always enjoy is just harking back to the approaches of that interrelationship with nature, where after hunting something that you were, a deer, many societies and traditions had the practice of saying a prayer to the spirit of the deer. That kind of relational nature, I think, is something that will get reintroduced into our ability to relate. And this is the, what Charles Eisenstein has called sort of sacred economics. But I think on a local level, that can particularly happen where you're able to see who is generating what value based upon what actions, in particular, if it is benefiting your local community. And you're able to specifically reward those individuals for their contributions on the basis of this honor flow, as it were. It's not just value flow, but it's also honor flow, and it's the recognition that comes with that. And so that non-fungible aspect, and again, I hesitate to use some of these terms because they've become tainted with all sorts of associations, but just so that you know that this is one way of looking at that potential for non-fungible tokens, NFTs, you may have heard of. It's actually in channeling a lot of that notional honor, that story, that provenance. And I think that's going to be much more widespread in terms of the ways that we actually account for and spend our monies. So that, again, it's not just about optimizing for the efficiency gains. It's not just about optimizing for whatever logic-based objective function we're trying to optimize, maybe carbon drawdown or whatever. But because carbon drawdown from a machine is so very different than carbon drawdown from a tree that is embedded within a forest of like thriving multi-species ecology, even though quantitatively that carbon is the same, the honor that is given and that is transferred in one versus the other is fundamentally different. And that is the role of that non-fungible piece. And so in 5 years' time, I hope to see that layer and infrastructure of non-fungible token recognition as part of these projects, as a part of this wider system, as well as that fungible piece, which a lot of the financiers are very excited about, and a lot of the carbon economy is premised around, okay, how do we draw down all of this carbon? I think this room understands the importance of looking beyond carbon to that sort of interdependence. And that's, again, like I said before, I don't think we can get fully to that quantitative basis for that yet. I know that you're all working very hard on trying to get to those standards, but even before that, and I think within the 5-year timeframe, we can definitely get to this layer of honoring that comes through art expression and the recording of some of this provenance of where some of this hard work is being done.
Okay, thank you so much, Tony. Yes, definitely looking beyond this little bit of a carbon tunnel vision, just emissions is definitely very relevant. And we just got a new question, like maybe the last question from the chat. From Carolina, working in a nonprofit in Uruguay, studying a vulnerable population of subspecies of bottlenose dolphin in collaboration with other research groups, because it's a meta-population system. They've been sharing photo catalogs to study migration, abundance, estimation, habitat usage. And she imagines that we could build some sort of blockchain-based shared catalog. And what do you think about it? And if this could be also a use case of biodiversity oracle?
Carolina, I'm very, very excited. I really, really am glad that you shared this example, because this is a 100% a case for how we would use the biodiversity oracle. Because you've not just got that underlying data there, but you're gathering photographs, you're gathering all of this related data that I think speaks to this story and this honoring, not just as an isolated species, but as a keystone species that is in an ecology that is affecting its niche, that is affecting its habitat, that has these migratory patterns. And I think that a lot of that next level of story, I think, is exactly the kind of information that would help to build relationships with people who care about that dolphin, but also care about that bioregion as a whole. And so I think even before we get to the point of trying to, again, dive deeper into the equivalence that one might draw between certain kinds of, ecological good here versus ecological good there, starting with the non-fungible aspect and really telling the story of these bottlenose dolphins and their habitat, and making those available for people around the world to connect, but then also potentially for other scientists to be able to be aware of what's happening there. And again, I just want to re-emphasize that I think one of the opportunities we have here is to use this layer to not only increase that relationship and the sort of notion of a interrelationship or a shared consciousness or awareness of the biodiversity, but it's also there to be able to allow scientists, conservationists, and others who are seeking to coordinate around that data. And so to the extent that this data that you've been collecting is not, in a usable sort of interoperable mechanism that others might be able to adopt as well. I mean, this goes into some of the other challenges in the sort of the wider sort of scientific collaboration space. I know that you guys must all be dealing with in various different ways as well. But I think that, the wider phenomenon of decentralized science is maybe something that Peter can have one of our friends come and talk about in the near future, because I think this plays into the potential for collaboration amongst scientists as well as amongst the wider population. And I imagine that the data that you've been gathering on the bottlenose dolphin population there is actually incredibly valuable to others who are studying some of the interdependencies and the wider ecology as well, to the extent that you're not, Carolina. So thank you for your question. Very excited. Would love to stay in touch. And if there's a way that we can work together, that would be tremendous.
Wonderful. So thank you so much, Tony, again, for answering all the questions as well and for presenting. And thank you to everyone for the questions as well. And I'm sending it back to Peter to introduce Leander from the IUCN Blockchain Interest Group.
Yeah, thanks so much, Carolina. Yeah, and just to sort of touch on that very last point, Tony, as we move on, I really love that you've hit on this concept of going through the data, not just seeing, of being able to see the forest through the trees, of sort of not just going beyond the notion that we have in conservation and monitoring of how many do we have, which is important, but beyond that, looking at how does this data inform our sense of system integrity in unique ecologies, and lending itself to, again, that sort of holistic metric of success, which I hope we'll come back to in the discussion. But for now, yeah, I want to pass it on to Leander Rees, who is one of our team inside the IUCN secretariat. And inside the secretariat, we have a number of people who are working on a blockchain related interest group. So a handful of folks who are sort of chipping away at this issue through some keystone projects inside the secretariat. And so again, a huge thank you to you, Leander, for joining us today. Yeah, I want to pass it over and see if you can share a bit of the work that's been going on inside the secretariat and have a look at what you're excited about right now.
All right, thanks. So I'll just take 1 minute, and afterwards, then Roman from the Perini Foundation will then present some of the work that the Perini Foundation has been doing together with IUCN. But so just quickly then what we are doing within the secretariat. I mean, so at the moment, we're still an informal group, but building it little by little. I would not call it, well, maybe a support group, partially, no, because this all started, of course, because there is so much going on related to blockchain technology and sustainability, where, of course, within IUCN at a certain time, it becomes a bit overwhelming. So you need a group to understand that, for example, you get contacted by, I don't know, why the people from Open Forest Protocol talking to us, and then Tello, and then, I don't know, Toucan, etc. It's a lot, no? There is really crypto trees, clicker tree, etc. So in part, we are a group also just to understand a little bit, what is going on. We're still too small to actually really understand all of that. No, but that's is definitely just a part of it, is to keep each other informed of everything that is going on, to look at potential interests. No, I think, for example, based on everything I've heard today, I cannot say that I understand the full complexity of it, but there definitely seems links between this biodiversity oracle and like the IUCN red list of species, etc. No, but I think I still need to digest that a little bit better in my mind. No, so then within IUCN, apart from that, of course, to not just as a learning group, but so we are developing and working on some blockchain applications as well. Some of them, for example, related to crowdsourcing to directly be able to finance farmers, although with some issues sometimes related, of course, to the use of cryptocurrency and regulations of our donors. I don't think specifically to IUCN. We're also working on seeing how we can strengthen restoration monitoring and use blockchain then to tokenize and the restoration actions and potentially strengthen the ownership of local farmers when they restore something. For example, a farmer restores something, then the carbon credits get sold, and there is potential disconnect. So how can we use blockchain to strengthen the place of farmers in there? Which is, of course, not only related to the work related to blockchain, but of course goes together with the process of digitalization at the same time. No? But then to give really a much more concrete example, more than happy afterwards or in the future to talk about some other examples. But so I'll give the floor to Roman from the Perini Foundation to present what they have been doing in collaboration with IUCN.
Okay, thanks a lot, Leander. Thank you, Peter, for inviting us to this talk. I would love to share my screen. I hope you see it. Is that okay?
Yes, we can see it.
Wonderful. So maybe Perini Foundation in a nutshell. We have been founded in 2017 at the intersection of blockchain and conservation. And when I started with blockchain, I still had black hairs actually, and it kind of changed the last 10 years. Swiss-based. And we started in 2018 with developing our own zero carbon conservation chain, and we also created a private digital Swiss francs. And Tony, I know that this is quite complicated to do. So I would have loved to know you earlier, so that you could have given us some information on how to do it best. But now it's done, and we're happy to use it. And Leander, you asked me to show quickly a few slides on two concrete projects we are working on with IUCN. One is, was mentioned earlier, is that combination from biodiversity and carbon. So that's a Swiss pilot we have here in Switzerland. We have the Cape Kyle on the right-hand side, beautiful bird. It's pretty under pressure, and it needs a specific kind of forest to live in. And what we did is actually, we tried to combine the management of the forest for biodiversity reasons with the carbon which is taken out, and try to develop a carbon certification system based on the IUCN Green standard and build a DLT market for it. So it's model based, and we ran the pilot in July 2022, so it's finished now, and it was quite a bit of success. So the idea was that the pilot is showing, it's just a pilot showing how much CO2 could be extracted and built or sold on a DLT market as certificates from a measure for biodiversity. So this is very concrete. It's a forest, existing forest in Switzerland. The measure has been done. We accounted for the certificates, and we calculated what actually could be generated as a certificate for a biodiversity measure. So a nice project. It's one connected to Tech for Nature, and we are going to, in the next step, we are going to create a new green list standard for carbon together with IUCN and build the DLT market. That's a concrete project. And the other one I would like to show is the nature collectibles. So it's always the difficulties, how can we generate funding out of nature assets? And this nature collectibles is a very simple approach. The idea is, you guys, some of you might watch the UEFA Championship coming up, and the World Championship on soccer, and some of you guys might know Panini booklets. So you actually collect cards, and we kind of stole that idea and made a Panini booklet for nature collectibles, which are species in protected areas, which you can collect and resell afterwards. So it's a mobile-based app. I can show you a little bit how it looks like, I guess. And it's all mobile. So we don't show the blockchain technology behind. You don't see it, but you can actually using it. It's actually a blockchain solution on a mobile phone. And you can buy and sell all the cryptos. You can use the digital Swiss franc. And the idea is that you have on the one hand side a donation part. So the first part, if a card is sold, it goes to 100% to the protected areas. There are no fees or anything. And it's transparent. So you can actually see when you buy something, you can see how it's added to the wallet from the protected area. And these cards are limited, so we have 500 for every protected area. And once they're all sold, then you can start reselling it, because a collector, our idea for a collector is he is collecting the cards. Once the page is full, he gets a badge, and then he doesn't really need the card anymore. And we are interested that he is reselling it. And when he resells it, he sets the price, and the revenues are shared again between the seller and the protected areas. That's the way we create recurrent funding. So it's not just selling it once, it's like a donation. No, you can resell it many, many times. And the idea is that a lot of people are actually filling their pages and getting their badges. Yeah, that's about what I wanted to show. And the real nice thing about it is that's actually working. And we are aiming for 500 protected areas. It's about 100,000 additional funding for every participating PA. So we're talking about 50 to 60 millions. 100 million locked in infrastructure, and the total project investment is 6 million. Still looking for 2. And we're scaling up right now. So we started a year ago with that specific project, and we launched a Kigali project or collection in July this year in Kigali. And we went to the development bank last week, and we go to the Huawei Connect this week or next week. And we launched the Madagascar connection. Now we're going to launch 1 connection a month. That's the goal. Happy to answer any questions if there are some, and thanks for the time and your interest.
Okay, thank you, Roman. Yeah, no, thanks to both of you for that quick update on sort of what's on at play in the Secretariat. Yeah, no, I think we'll be excited to see more kind of as different projects and things come down the track. So I want to sort of bring us back together around the next piece of this, which is a discussion to really dig into, again, sort of looking at the ecosystem of blockchain as it's being applied to conservation, and to really identify some of the hard stuff in this. As this is a new generation of infrastructure that's being applied to conservation right now, and as really a lot of this stuff is being done for the first time, we've got an existing foundation of knowledge products from groups like the IUCN, some amazing data sets that are all around the world and stored in the servers of different conservation NGOs, governments, and communities that are sort of like, that is meeting a sort of new lattice of applicability through Web3, through ledgers, and through different blockchain applications. So I really want to leverage the knowledge that we've got in the room, because we've got some fantastic people here like Tony, and we've also I see we've also got Tika and Ned here who are coming back here from the Regen Network, and a bunch of other folks like Carolina, who's with African Data Tech as well, who are in the heart of this. And I really want to dig into, just to start us off, and we can let the discussion carry on from there with the time we've got. But I really want to kick off with, what are the really prescient needs that we have right now in this ecosystem? And what's the sort of, whether that's from ourselves being the IUCN as one piece in this ecosystem, but also to hear from some of these projects on the ground who are trying to build this architecture out. What are the needs that we need to address in the next 2 years to see this infrastructure really spread its wings and take hold? I'm actually going to be a bit mean and pick on Tony first, because I see his tile right next to mine.
So the question is, what will be needed to help this all really take off in the context of some of the siloization? I think my own perspective and my own bias is that we're going to need, as I said, a lot more interdisciplinary meetings and gatherings like this, and we're going to need this to happen at all different kinds of levels. I think there's going to hopefully be some versions of these global forms that can be made use of in sort of in localities. And at the same time, I think that there are certain sort of global sort of galvanizing events that, to the extent that they can help people connect into like something that's happening at a global level, and it sort of like sparks that consciousness and awareness. And one example of this is going to be in June or July next year, for example. One of our collaborators has previously done sort of these big projection mapping experiences onto the Vatican and onto the sort of the COP buildings themselves. He's going to be doing one on the river-facing side of the UN building in June. It's going to be a CNN broadcast, 3-4 hour long globally, and it's just going to be, you know, endangered species, youth activist leaders, and again, he's done this previously, but this time the idea is that we are going to be tying in a lot of this follow-on engagement and activation infrastructure involving things like the collectibles that we just saw. And I think a combination of these global events and the ability to sort of take action on a local level, I think that's going to be one of those key stepping stones in awareness and activation. So you can go directly from experience into connection and action.
Yeah, I'll kind of build on Tony's comments. Hi, Tika from Regen Network. And I would say a big piece is accessibility and understanding. So, how folks on the ground can understand that this opportunity exists, understand how to engage in it. I know that at Regen, that's a big push for us right now in our communication and storytelling. So people at all levels can understand what it is that we're doing, what opportunities exist, how to engage in those opportunities. And one thought that we've had recently is kind of working with existing groups on the ground. So we were just at a meeting, and there's state level organizations like the NRCD that you could tap into, educate those already trusted organizations about what we're doing and have that filter out into the community that way. So using, regional existing trusted organizations as methods for getting our message out, for training people in it. So yeah, we're really exploring that. How do we increase our audience and those that are excited to engage in us?
Great. And I think maybe to just piggyback on that, Tika, I think one of the things that again, a lot of this comes down to communication and being able to translate in between different sets of stakeholders who are speaking sometimes radically different languages. But there's an immense amount of power in that if, again, you can keep bringing people together around this and bringing their shared understandings up to sort of meet each other. And something that seems to come up in some different projects around this as we sort of begin to try and tokenize carbon, biodiversity, these big sort of amorphous things, is that the teams who are approaching this from Silicon Valley, or who are sort of coming from a technical background, are building these amazing and interesting architectures, but sometimes lack the ecological support or existing knowledge from scientists who are in the field to really sort of to really stabilize their sort of intentions and their assumptions around it. Do any of you find that sort of where that match has been missed, or where that's been done really well?
I'm not, I mean, it links to what you said, but it's about a mismatch. And it's one that we will, try to correct now as well. I have to admit, we started like working a bit more on blockchain when, we were not able to travel anymore, and we kind of disconnected from the field, and we're looking for ways to strengthen that relationship. But one of the errors that we made, but I don't think we're the only ones, is that we started with the technological solution. And only then we went to the field and actually asked the people with whom we're working whether they're actually interested in this. You know, I mean, okay, you have an operating blockchain, but then the question is that, you know, I mean, so what we're going to do next year is in part change that and yeah, go back to the field, but not with an existing solution and see, you know, how it operates on the field, but actually slightly take a step back there, no, and redevelop and ask, and in this case with local farmers in Rwanda, how they see this this solution playing in. This, of course, goes specifically for the type of thing that we are looking at, which is landscape restoration and how you can incentivize local farmers, etc., no, and finance that part. But it's, I mean, yeah, as I said, like when we started working on this, we also did not have any possibility to travel. But that's definitely, I think, sometimes potentially something that is missing, no? And then, like, yeah, the technological solutions, I think it's definitely needed, but there is a gap, and if we are not careful, we're just making it bigger and not smaller, especially when we talk about the connection with local communities.
Thanks for that, Leander. Dorian, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Dorian Fougere here. A little bit of a head cold, end of COVID. I'm the chair for the Social Ecological Resilience and Transformation Thematic Group. So welcome everybody, and thank you to Peter and Carolina for putting on this webinar series, and thank you, Tony, for joining us, as well as Leander and Porini Foundation. Yeah, Leander just kind of triggered me. I've been listening and making a couple of notes. I'll just say, it's your question, Peter, around some of the disconnects. I mean, in my daytime, I just started working for Carbon Disclosure Project, now just called CDP. So I'm based here in Berlin. And so Tony, going way back to the top, I guess one of the things I see, Peter, sometimes is the disc between these different epistemic or these different professional communities, because whether you're looking at Europe and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or you're looking at the Securities Exchange Commission in the United States, or you're looking at International Sustainability Standards Board, there are frameworks that have been being built or are in various aspects of existing that exist for disclosure. You also have the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And so, you know, those types of platforms try to find transparency for companies, for example, corporations that will disclose publicly while upholding privacy laws like the general GDPR, General Data Privacy Regulation here in the European Union. So, but it didn't seem like so much like Stanford is necessarily working those. I know California, as having lived in California for 20 years, as progressive as the United States is, sometimes it's not always at the leading front of these. So I think part of the challenge, Peter, is the communication or some of the disconnect. A couple other very short things, 2-3 other short things. I think when we shared some of this idea for webinar series with the SERT members, Peter and Carolina got some of the stock responses that you might hear. I wouldn't necessarily call some my colleagues, my friends, Luddites, but you know, the general reaction of what you hear in the press. And I think there is a lot of concern around green credentials. And I think, unfortunately, people get stuck with ideas of where the technology was 5 years ago in terms of data intensivity. I don't track it carefully, but I have seen some new market improvements. I think in that sense, I'll just mention for the women from Porini Foundation, it's terrific to hear that you're working on, you mentioned some kind of a green list standard, a green list standard for carbon, I guess, associated with these blockchain technologies. I think something like that would be fantastic. I think it fills a gap for people that otherwise are hesitant or nervous to really understand piece part of it, but there is a mission or group within the ecosystem management that is starting to develop a paper on carbon markets, some of their challenges, some of their issues, and maybe looking also at biodiversity offsets and biodiversity markets. So I think fundamentally, basically what Leander and Porini Foundation are leading is terrific and timely. Just a second piece, I was also impressed with the nature collectibles. Just for those who might be watching, it's Fat Bear Week in Alaska. So for Katmai National Park in Alaska, in the past 10 years, it's become this, you know, very popular. Now it's people actually donate money in the same way they do for a professional championship. It's not the World Cup per se, but it is this competition. So I think there's an accessibility piece that Tika mentioned as well, where I think it's terrific again with Parini that you're providing the technology on the back end, but you don't have to tell people how it's done. You don't have to get them into the complexity of the technologies to show them really how it can promote change. The last two pieces are very short. There are other kind of challenges I see, Peter. I think there's a scale issue. I think it's terrific that Tony and his colleagues are working towards global frameworks. And when we have Ed and I forget the other gentleman's name, Sam maybe from Regen Network last time, there are things that are very place-based and have a lot of community input, a lot of community buy-in. So, how do you get from those two ends of the spectrum to meet somewhere in the middle to build on their strengths? So there's a lot of scale there. The last piece is, I think there's also a kind of coupling of the technology platforms with the analysis that I don't know if it's really there. If I think about, disclosure on biodiversity or disclosure on climate impacts and so forth, I think the disclosure is a huge part of it, getting the information out there, letting people look at it, letting them trace it. But it still then needs to be made sense of, right? So what if you're, avoiding conversion of X number of hectares? Is that enough? So I'm just encouraging us also to think about not simply gathering the information, doing the monitoring, making it transparent and shareable, but also then what is the complementary interface for really being able to make sense of that data? Where's the technology kind of analytics and synthesis to make sense of the kind of disclosure, for lack of a better word. So it's a lot of stuff, Peter, but I've been listening and I think it's a terrific webinar, and I appreciate you and all our colleagues for having joined. I'll stop there.
No, thank you so much for that, Dorian. All really prevalent points here. Do you want to jump in, Carolina? I see you've got your hand up.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. So I think that from a DSI point of view, this could be like an amazing opportunity for conservation biologists groups like mine to connect and share information, because one problem that we have in science and that what DSI movement is stepping up is to solve the problem of shared data and validate those data. And I think that if we get to build up decentralized platforms from data sharing and validation, we'll be able to enhance collaboration, and maybe we can achieve shared goals of conservation of particularly protected areas and also to management areas, in particular to areas that are, shared by 2 or more countries. And we have to collaborate between different research groups and countries to do management of that area. So I think that this could be very powerful in that sense. Thank you so much for organizing this webinar. You all brought very interesting points and thoughts.
No, thank you, Carolina. And exactly to your point, this is something that came up in our last webinar, and I'm glad we've still got Ned Horning here on the call, because he specifically mentioned this in the DSI community. One thing that we're seeing is that we have a lot of people who are working on biotech in DSI at the moment, but we are not seeing yet people coming through who are working on agroecology or or conservation necessarily. So yeah, excited to flush that point out a little further. Yeah. But David, you've got your hand up as well. David, I think your mic's not on yet.
What about now?
Perfect.
Yeah, better. Thank you. Yeah, I'm David from Peru. I call in a company called Nature Services, and I just have a comment. I think if we focus, if we can continue moving forward one particular use case, that usually is a robust approach, and I'm thinking in, for instance, the payments. Okay. And also payments are special because they can be used in different areas or fields, right? So they are sort of a transversal type of phenomena. So moving money under could be for specific niche cases like carbon credits or offsets, in biodiversity offsets, but also in a more broader sense within the under the umbrella of payments for ecosystem services. And then I think that we can arrange, you know, recent developments from science, but also from other technologies and other groups, other communities that are also making progress. I'm thinking like in the Lightning Network, for instance, this idea of using the Bitcoin blockchain to facilitate value transfer. So it's not the Bitcoin as money, but just the protocol, right? The network. And finally, I think that payments is something that people on the ground could be, even in rural areas, they get this idea of payments, right? So perhaps blockchain or climate change is kind of confusing for them, but not payments and contracts, I think, to a certain point. So yeah, that will be my suggestion, just to keep making progress in a particular use case like payments. Yeah.
Thanks for that, David. And Sungnitu, if you want to jump in.
Okay, thank you. Supporting what David was saying, it's really very important to look at that network. However, my concern is more of within the African region, that will have a whole lot of potential, but it seems like there's some level of insincerity when it comes to biodiversity related activities in the continent. And it has really hindered a lot of benefits and commitment in terms of biodiversity conservation and translating it to products, because of course, these people are either lowly educated or uninformed, and there are a whole lot of challenges, and the population keep growing, and there are a whole lot of mix-up. So how can, for once, most of the companies that are operating in Africa are even from the global north, and they do things that they don't do within their country? Can we be for once sincere to move the global economy forward, please? Thank you.
I know we're close to time, but maybe I'll jump in here a little bit. So I'm not African, or I'm not living in Africa. I'm actually the only person on my team that is not currently working out of South Africa. But what we are trying to do is we're developing an application, and we're really trying to create something simple that allows the people that are doing the work in different nature-based solution projects. And we're starting with biochar because something that small organic farmers are really starting to get into. And to help them collect the data on the ground without needing a lot of digital literacy, without needing a lot of training, to really show that they're doing the work. And we're also trying to connect with scientists and verifiers that they can then take a look at the data and say that, yes, this process is being done correctly before this data can even be put on chain. Because we also see a lot of people here mentioned also the importance of this connection between scientists and the work being done. And yes, the validity of the data that is even being put on the blockchain, I think, is very important, and giving people access to it. And maybe they don't actually need to understand everything, all the technical details around blockchain, but really creating a solution that translates all of this information, I think, is very, very relevant.
Thank you for that, Carolina. And yeah, I think just to echo this back, we've got a couple minutes left that we can sort of round this out in. But I'm really, I really think that's something that's coming up again and again and again, is that the solutions we're designing have to be accessible to the entire world. In whatever architectures we're building through these sorts of value systems or tools, they have to be applicable in people's lives. And it's all well and good if we can itemize them from inside a global finance facility. But unless they're accessible on a mobile phone with a tenuous electrical energy infrastructure, and to a whole range of different cultural lenses, we won't see them sink in and be adopted by communities and cultures around the world. And so it's sort of imperative on all of us as practitioners in this space to really take that to heart and to really continue kind of building out that understanding in how we're applying this work. So I think we might have time for one or two other interventions if people have something they're really burning to get across. No? All right. Well, yeah, this has been fantastic, everyone. Frank, go for it. You're last in the post.
Just to use or to, I don't know if Tony's here. Tony's also jumped, or no, Tony's there. Hi, Tony, or in fact, to anybody in the group. Governance has been mentioned. The importance engaging local people, the problems with that, in fact, has been mentioned. There's been quite a lot of advance with this concept of DAOs in blockchain, decentralized autonomous organizations, but they seem to have an enormous amount of problems with governance themselves. So how far has this concept of governance on the blockchain come?
Frank, this is a question that will be quite hard to answer in 2 minutes, but it really is one of the more fundamental issues. And I will say that it's when we talk about governance on the blockchain, we're not talking about necessarily just governance of these platforms themselves. So, for example, you've got this idea of like the governance of the Ethereum blockchain. You know, what does that mean? Okay, there's all these technical issues and various different things. What I'm more interested in actually is what we can do with governance with blockchain. Right. So these are two separate things. You can have governance over a blockchain, and you can use blockchain in order to govern things. And I think that's the more interesting part. And that's when we start looking at, you know, what are all the various different things that we want to try and govern in terms of especially digital objects and data. And when we think about that, we can start just thinking about, you know, something everybody knows, the internet. And so we had a very interesting gathering with the Internet Archive up in the Mendocino Woods just about a month ago for a gathering called DWebCamp. And we had an entire track that I was curating called Building Governance Layers for the Internet. Because when we think about the internet, that is essentially what the blockchain is an inheritor for, but we're able to embed more governance around the things that we do. Governance being things like, are you who you say you are? So this whole notion of identity is incredibly important. Not just identity of the actors and involved, but the identity of all the various different agents, the identity of the contracts, the identity of the computation you want to run. So that is one aspect of governance. There's other aspects of governance around, for example, data sharing and data ownership and data protection, right? That's also something that, you know, is tied to governance of the internet and governance of how we interact. But blockchain-based systems are providing for lower cost ways that are more easily enforceable. And again, it's from a conceptual basis, there are certain affordances that are involved when you have this sort of open, transparent accountability framework that are about reducing the costs of dispute resolution and reducing the cost of conflict, making sure that everybody can be seen to doing things. So I'll leave it there, but I just wanted to make the difference between using blockchain to govern things like the data and the wider internet and, for example, the climate internet or the carbon internet, and why that is interesting. And then governance of the blockchains themselves, which often comes with all sorts of different hurdles because you're talking about technicians and software programmers coordinating with miners. And, you know, and again, separate kettle of fish is complex, and not least because there are certain people within the blockchain ecosystem who very much believe that politics can be eradicated, and they come from a ideological position where they're trying to have as much as possible encoded into the blockchain. They're often what's called blockchain maximalists. Those of us who come from a sociological, law, policy, governance background say you can't eradicate politics politics is always going to be there. It's in the nature of human beings and the way that we communicate that there is political economy embedded in there. What we can do is make it more transparent, make it fairer, more just, more accessible, more inclusive, and less drudgery, right? Because there's often a lot of bureaucracy involved in governance, and we can take that out. And so we can make it smoother, more pleasant. And so that's that distinction I wanted to make. I'm still very excited about using blockchain for governance of various different things, including carbon offsets and biodiversity, things like that. And reticent about saying that all of the challenges of actually governing the way that blockchains operate themselves will be solved soon. But you know, there are groups working on it, and I'll send a little link to that. We called it the Redwood Parliament, which was this sort of building governance layers. I'll send a little link to that. A little post I did about that. But Frank, hopefully that answers your question slightly.
Thank you very much. Yep.
Brilliant. I think that's a wonderful place to leave us on, Tony. And that through the last hour and a half, we've covered a huge amount of ground here, from really fundamental blockchain architectures to specific instances of how this is getting applied in conservation, and looking forward and ahead is sort of what does this critical ecosystem need right now, and sort of how are all of us interacting with it at this sort of at this membrane in between these two worlds. So looking forward from here, what I'm really excited to see is the critical focus right now, and the sort of the bridges to cross around education, around interdisciplinary collaborations, around sort of understanding the people who are all using and participating in these systems, and really again this sort of this fundamental point of access to these technologies, and how do we sort of bring all of the participants in the space of conservation into this in a way that everyone is able to understand and translate between each other, and help kind of forge our way through these new infrastructures together. So yeah, I want to really close out by thanking you all for joining us today on this session, and especially to Tony for coming and presenting, and also to Leander and to Roman for their thoughts and their contribution to this. Also, especially want to thank my co-lead in this project, Carolina, for us as sort of we've wandered through this unfamiliar landscape together, and helped try to put some frame as to sort of what IUCN's position and opportunity in this whole space is, and bring these pieces together. But I think I will probably leave any closing remarks to Dorian, who is our sort of chair for the SERT group within CEM.
I've said enough. Thank you, Peter. I'm good. I'll leave it to you and Carolina if that was anything else. Thank you, though.
I just wanted to extend the same thing. I think Peter said everything, and to extend to you as well, Dorian. Thank you for the support, all the support you've lent us throughout the whole process of putting together these webinars. Thank you again so much, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you for the time.
Thank you all. So yeah, we'll have of course the recording of this webinar out pretty soon to you, along with hopefully any slides that we've got from along the way. And yeah, if you have any further questions or want to make some connections across this ecosystem, get in touch with us, and we're happy to do some dot connecting and keep the conversation going.
Great, thank you. Bye, guys.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Oh, I should have stopped this recording.